It is my honor to introduce the moderator of this session, Ms. Alexandra Robinson, Technical Advisor on Gender-Based Violence from the Gender and Human Rights Branch of UNFPA.
Thank you so much. So welcome this afternoon, and as you heard, this session is about technology and data and about promoting a resilient and a smart future. And I'm really humbled today to be joined by a wonderful panel of speakers. We have Riddhi Kashyap, Professor Riddhi Kashyap from Oxford University, Makoda Noda from NEC, and finally Andrea Roy-Jones from New York University, the Data Science Center. We are also joined online by Rezwanul Haq-Jami from the Bangladesh government. And unfortunately, we have another panelist, Rebecca Rakatimbo, who was coming from DRC, but she has been stuck in the way. So she was in transit in Delhi, and we don't have her online just yet, but she may join over the course of the session. So thank you very much again, everyone, for being with us. Really what we're talking to today is new forms of data, but also old forms of data and how we have new ways of using them because of technology. We're hoping to explore some of the challenges, but also the opportunities of that data. And essentially, we're going to try and cover all of that ground in 60 minutes. We're going to run a first round of questions around what the data is that we're talking about, what some of the challenges with that data is, and finally, what some of the solutions to those challenges are so that we can genuinely use this data to promote strengthened demographic analysis. So with that, Andrea, I will turn to you. It'll be great as a data scientist to talk to what is big data, what is it that we're talking about, and why are there challenges associated with it?
Sure, I would be happy to talk about that. And I want to apologize first in advance for my Americanization. I'll be saying data because I'm uncivilized, so very sorry about that. But I am a professor of data science at New York University, and one of the first things I say to my students is, well, what is data? What is big data? Why are you in this class? Why are you interested in data? And for the most part, my students and also folks that I talk with in the corporate world and in other consulting work, we have this idea that data is somehow truth, right? That it's this capital T truth. It's like, this is what's in the data, therefore this is what's in reality. And it can approximate the truth, but I think it's more useful to think about data, especially in this context here at this event, to think about it in the context of information. And it's information that we've decided to collect. So data doesn't exist out in the ether on its own. Data is information that I, as a researcher, I, as a policymaker, have decided to go out and write something down about what's going on, how many people are in this household, what the poverty level is in this area, and so on. And so data is just information, and it can be information that's text, and obviously, increasingly, if you're following the news with generative AI, it can be video, and it can be images, and it can be all kinds of what we call unstructured information as well. The big question of what is big data, I think, is something that people get very worked up about, and I'll probably cause some controversy here, but my working definition of big data is it doesn't really matter whether we're working with data or big data, because both are subject to the same limitations and the same possibilities. And so the I guess, traditional definition that I work with, if you must distinguish big data, is it's data that's big enough to require more than one kind of relatively powerful laptop to make sense of. So it's enough data that it needs to live across multiple servers or up in the cloud. And why is it so big? Well, it could be big because it has lots of observations, say information about tons and tons and tons and tons of people. Or it could be big, or it could also be big in terms of information about those observations, so the attributes, so the columns in that data. So it could be I don't have that many people in my data set, but I've tracked all this, say, social media behavior data, and I have thousands of bits of information about what they clicked on, how long they were there, whether they followed through, whether they liked, how often they post, da, 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 da. Lots of times data is big for both of those reasons, but not always. And so I think as we go with our conversation, it will be helpful to be mindful of big how. And if we're working with population data, maybe it's really big in one way versus another. If we're working with fertility data, maybe there's not that many observations, but we have a lot of information about, say, a handful of women or something like that. Generally speaking, though, I think the key point that I think about and talk about all the time about data is we really need to be thoughtful about where data comes from, how it's collected, why it was collected, and what we're doing with it afterwards. So basically the entire life cycle of the data. And I guess the last thing I'll say at this point is that, you know, a big theme, and I think this won't be a surprise to folks in the room, is that data tends to reflect our priorities as a society. We have more data on things that we, generally all of us, value more. Usually those are things that are very, very important for, say, politicians, are very important for companies. We have so much data in the advertising space compared to data on, say, the healthcare space, for instance. We also tend to have data about topics that are more widely seen to be pertinent. So, for example, in the 1980s in the United States, there was very little data on HIV/AIDS because it was deemed not that important, and it took 10 years more and a lot of advocacy to start collecting data on that topic. And so anytime we look at data that's out there in the world, one of the first things I recommend that we do is we say, what data are we missing? Who are we not counting in this data set? Who doesn't have access to the tools or the resources or the connectivity by which we're collecting this data? And what are we not asking about? What are we not looking into? And in many parts of the world, there are things that we can't ask about. But that makes it very difficult to draw inferences. And that doesn't mean we don't use the data, but it means we should be really thoughtful about what we're missing when we're calculating trends and making forecasts, as much as looking at the data that we have. I could also talk about this for 10 more years, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you. At this point, I would add that Rebecca Roccatimbo, who can't be with us today, the area of work that she was going to talk to is around data generated through technologies and the way in which the data generated through technologies is used then for AI and generative AI systems. And largely what she has been working on is how that big data generated through technologies is driven by people who have access to the technologies in the first place, which then creates an inherent bias in the data that's produced. So she has done a lot of work, and hopefully if she joins online she can speak to some of her work, but part of that has been work around a gender action plan for Mozilla Foundation, which largely is looking at how do we actually address the bias in big data generated through technologies, specifically because of issues with access and language. So with that, and I'm sorry to kind of speak for Rebecca's area of work, but maybe really it'd be really great, I think, to hear from you around the diversity in demographic data sources, and what are some of the challenges in access to use in big data in your work?
Yeah, thanks very much, Alex. And thanks also to the other panelists. It's really exciting to be here participating in this global dialogue and talking about the future of populations and data and demographic diversity. So I guess in many ways, the digital revolution has benefited demographic data ecosystems, not just because they've made for new sources of data generated by the use of digital technologies, but also helped old sources of sort of traditional demographic data. So by this I mean that if we think about demography as a discipline, it's historically been a very data-driven discipline. It's historically been interested in big data insofar as anything about populations is large. And in that way, if we think about demography as a sort of a big data discipline, we can think about censuses. The canonical form of population enumeration as also being a source of big data that demographers have used for a long period of time. But if we look to the last 25 years, with improvements in computational power and the storage of large troves of information, census microdata at the individual level are now increasingly available, which is a really powerful source for greater disaggregation, granularity, for the kinds of information that we need on populations. Similarly, there is improvements in accessibility of administrative data sources, which are also a vital source of information. I mean, we call it vital registration for a reason. They're vital sources of information on population and population dynamics. So, and of course, with the increasing potential for the digitization of public services and delivery of public services, we can only expect that at least the potential availability for administrative data should increase. Now, of course, the landscape on this is uneven, and while parts of Europe have completely, they don't have censuses anymore, we've moved completely to population registers, there are still, of course, large parts of the world where even basic forms of vital registration are still lacking. So there's still a lot of unevenness in the availability of old traditional sources of population data, such as vital registration, government administrative records, and of course, censuses. We should acknowledge that those too have benefited a lot from digitalization and new technologies. That being said, when we think about challenges of this kind of demographic data revolution and the diversification of the demographic data systems, I think there are sort of several that come to mind. As I've said already, first and foremost, there's a lot of unevenness in access. There's unevenness in access in terms of the kinds of sources we have in different places, both in traditional sources of data, and of course, we can come back to the unique challenges that come with sort of non-traditional digital sources of data. So there's a lot of sort of unevenness in access, and particularly when we think about non-traditional sort of digital trace data sources, such as those generated by the use of web, social media, or mobile technologies, there's a unique access of also the provenance of those data. These are often captured, stored, and held by private companies, and often they're collected for business purposes, so they're repurposing for research or for scientific and population policy relevant work requires essentially navigating issues that are complicating access to them. There's also a degree of, particularly with these, again, digital trace data sources, there's also issues of a sort of lack of transparency and understanding of the data generating process. We don't know to what extent what we measure is shaped or influenced by different kinds of algorithms. To give you an example, a lot of social media data is now being used to monitor population migration trends. But of course, the underlying ways in which sort of how mobility is measured is not always clear. Is it based on, for example, changes in IP address? Is it based on self-reported profile information? And this is the kind of thing that we don't really particularly know. And I think it's important for us to unpack if we really want to sort of think about larger scale, more accountable deployments of these data sources within population data systems. There's, of course, a lack of consent, particularly around new sources of digital data. So if we think about traditional sources, the bedrock principle of survey research is informed consent. And of course, for a lot of passively generated sources of behaviors online, for example, or our mobile use, there isn't necessarily that kind of contract of implicit consent, which raises, again, unique challenges of usability. And I think, of course, Andrea has already talked about this, but I want to emphasize, of course, bias and exclusion. I mean, the core of the demographic data enterprise is population generalizability, right? We want to say things about populations and be able to disaggregate and talk about granularity and difference and diversity. But of course, we won't measure that particularly well or be able to say that this represents populations if there are, for example, all sorts of issues of selection and bias in who uses technologies and platforms that generate new sources of data. This is not to say that traditional sources of population data are immune from these things. Of course, censuses have also coverage errors. But I think there are different types of bias and exclusion issues that we have to think about. That being said, we shouldn't forget about bias and exclusion and also the importance, for example, of things like post-enumeration surveys for traditional sources of data collection like censuses too. So thinking about who is captured and who is not, who is represented, who is not, in different streams of data is, I think, fundamental when we think about the evolving data ecosystem that we have.
Thank you, Riddhi. And I think with that, Makoto, it would be really valuable to hear from you about the work of NEC and your engagement in enabling data collection as a public digital good. So I will turn over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So also really wanted to join these conversations. So this is Makoto from NEC, one of the leading Japanese IT company. Outside of Japan, we got NEC, but anyway. So we are the 100,000 working force over the world, 7 research and development centers over the world, 125 years history. They're working for the really tech to, especially my team is really focused for the tech for the social impact, to utilize the right technology to reach out to the issues, especially the social issues, to improve the operation, improve the efficiency. Those are the kind of things we really focus on that. So in terms of the role of the private sectors, the company point of view, so we are actually the solution providers for the digital technologies to leverage of those of the digitized and also the data management, also the protections, including how to utilize the right data to right decisions. So I want to highlight one of the case studies, so which my company involved is India. So we call the HOW program. This is the largest 1.4 billion people join this ID program. So this is ID program combined. So the personal information like a name and address also combined with the biometrics data. So biometrics data utilize the identifications. Then those of the ID, other HOW program to provide all of the population in India. So to like a social protection services, educations, so family planning, those are the healthcare systems as well. So those are the systems really we can call the inclusive by design. So to all of the nations, because of one of the things is biometrics we utilize, or the multimodal, we call multimodal biometrics, which means face is a face, or the fingerprint, or the iris is an eye design, eye pattern. So utilize those of whichever those of the information can protect of the populations, then to get into services. So this is a really important use cases. Then at the same time of how to secure those data in terms of the security, also how transparent those data usage. This is a really important things. Then also in terms of the inclusiveness to the populations. So other HOW program is really combine the government policies. They call the Common Service Center, this is CCS, is the public services nationwide, especially the rural area. I think this is the CCS is 6 million nationwide in the Indian country's context. Then, especially for the vulnerable populations in the rural area, they can understand technologies. They even don't have the connectivity of the internet and also some of the devices. But the CCS can support those of the population to include those of the people come to those CCS centers to register. Then they got the identity. Then they can receive the right amount of the subsidy program, also some kind of education. Also, even they can open the bank account, then utilize, connect to the purchase the mobile line. So those are things is one of the cases I want to highlight this solution. Yeah, thank you.
And I think with that it would be, we've got really great representation of, demographers and academics who are using that data in research, the private sector who are supporting digitalization. But now I have the privilege of introducing Mr. Rezwanul Haq-Jami, who works as the head of commercialization and e-commerce in Aspire to Innovate program with the government of Bangladesh.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry. Rezwanul, I wanted to talk to you. I mean, clearly the big part of your project is around digital public infrastructure and a real drive by the Bangladesh government to create technology as a public good. I wanted to ask you what some of the benefits are, but also key challenges that you have in supporting citizen-centered technologies for such a diverse and clearly changing population in Bangladesh.
Thank you. So the core digitization drive that we started back in 2008 and 2009, the total DPI or digital public infrastructure concept was not there. So a lot of the citizen-centric solutions that we developed from the government, not only A2I itself, but the other government agencies, were in fact siloed developments. So a lot of data that were generated by these platforms were siloed. There was no data interoperability. A lot of different verifiable identities were also developed, right? So unlike the way we think about CRVS or verifiable registries, that was not organically developed. Now, we learned from our experience, and although national ID and birth registration are two examples of verifiable truths that we have, identities that we have, slowly the systems that the government have created try to converge or create interoperable data exchanges. So what we did from the government, we actually launched an initiative called BNDA, Bangladesh National Data Architecture. So it's a single architecture that every government systems need to follow for data interoperability. And you'll be happy to know that we are passing a legislation in the parliament and turning it into a law. So any public systems that are going to come will have to follow this interoperable architecture. Now, through that, over the years, the challenges that, the benefits are numerous, of course, but the challenges that we got, I think my esteemed colleague from University in New York has already touched on that. And a lot of data outliers were there. The way the systems are designed, a lot of the populations are always, counted out from this data. Just to give you an example, when these big systems were designed with digitization in mind. If you look at the simple data of how many people in Bangladesh are connected to internet, you'll find a large portion of the population are still not connected to internet. A lot of the government systems are digitized, but people are not accessing them directly. So how they are accessing those services? They are accessing those services via assisted means. They are going somewhere to get assistance in connecting those services. So key demographic data on who is accessing that service, what are their demographics are getting lost. So we are now trying to find ways to create access modalities so that equitable access to that those services are being ensured. So not only when we design a system that should be app-based, AI-based, or very advanced user interface-wise, we are now going back to the roots. We are trying to create government solutions which can be accessible through IVRs, which can be connected to your, MSI SDNs or your phone mobile identity, so that we can at least get data on who is using it, which demographics of or economic demographic, different demographics we are trying to connect. Back to you.
Thank you.
Passing it to you seems to help yours work.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I think the issue of access is incredibly important because it's a lack of access by particularly quite diverse and sometimes marginalized groups, that really draws the bias in. So when we're using that data for analysis, it means that we're really entrenching or reproducing and reinforcing systems of discrimination in the analysis. So, I mean, it's really wonderful to hear you speak to the way in which you're understanding, ways around and means through which you can promote more equitable more equitable access, which then I think brings us to a second round, really around, what are some of the potential solutions to the access issue, the bias issue? How do we use the data or how do we leverage the data revolution to be able to support, evidence-based policy, financing, programming? So maybe really I can turn to you first to speak to how you think we can address that potential in bias as we witness this digitalization of national systems, and what kind of solutions you see most effective. I think, just to add, I think one of the things we haven't spoken about a great deal, and you touched on it, was this issue around personal consent and what that looks like. And when we're creating digital national systems, is there consent to be part of it, or is it at a point where you have to be part of it to be able to access to access services?
Perfect. I think it's working, yeah. So I think, it's hard to sort of, given the sort of diversity of data sources that, when I think of the demographic data revolution I have in mind, I think it's very hard to sort of speak about just one solution, but I can think of a sort of range of solutions that pertain to different types of data sources. So first, I think I want to emphasize that just because we now have new sources of data, that traditional population data sources are no longer relevant. In fact, quite the contrary. I think traditional sources of population data, by which I mean, vital registration, CRVS, I mean population censuses, I mean population data registers where those are available, in addition to a host of large-scale population surveys and demographic surveillance sites, all remain extremely valuable sources of data. That being said, even with those data sources, we know that there are sort of evolving and changing conceptions of privacy in the world, right? Which means that there are all sorts of ways in which we have now, and all sorts of reasons that create new challenges around response rates, for example, into traditional survey instruments. So again, coming back to this point of, we need to recognize that within an evolving data ecosystem, we need to stress the value of traditional sources of population data and recognize that the best evidence-based policy work that leverages the data revolution is one that integrates and leverages the complementarities of both traditional and non-traditional sources of data. And that investment in traditional population data sources is more valuable than ever, right? And I think this kind of financing question is a really important one. So a big solution is investment and financing in traditional population data sources and infrastructure, while at the same time recognizing also that there may be complementarities to leverage from non-traditional sources that provide, for example, higher frequency measurement, or provide complementary measurement because they might provide new takes via a behavioral measure rather than a self-reported measure. So I think thinking a bit about how the whole system fits together, but within that, emphasizing the value of and the importance of traditional sources of population data, if for no other reason than the fact that we have a long history of thinking about what to do with those, and we have a good understanding of those. And I think that's really key. And for non-traditional, say, digital data sources, traditional sources are really important because they provide sources for validation and training, right? The second solution that I can think of is that we need, and I think Rezvanul has already talked about this, which I appreciate, that, with the digitalization of public services in particular, that creates, obviously, for service delivery, new opportunities, but it also creates new data opportunities. But at the same time, with these new data opportunities and models for service delivery, I think we need to hold governments and the providers of those services to account to actually collect data on who accesses them at points of access, how they access them, in order to come back to this question of to what extent is this re-entrenching inequalities or actually realizing the potential to reshape them, right? Because at least that's theoretically what we hope, that more cost-efficient digital public infrastructure could potentially enable access in better ways to marginalized groups, but is that really happening? Is something that is ultimately ultimately an empirical question, and one that requires us to actively collect data at points of service, points of delivery, demographically disaggregated data to see who actually benefits from different forms of digital public infrastructure. And I think another solution that is really relevant in this space is to thinking about, well, I alluded to this earlier, there are all sorts of issues of access and challenges of access to new sources of data, such as those from the web, social media, mobile phone use, or sensor-based measures. And for many of these data sources, access remains a key challenge because, of course, the data generating process, a lot of these are sources that are held by private companies and they're intrinsic to their business models. And there isn't always a very linear, clear pathway to access, or I would say, a lot of the discussion is around access, but actually, I would like our conversation to really be about co-production. Like, how should we be thinking about what these data are, and ultimately it's about individuals that generate them, right? And I'll come back to the issue of consent, but it's individuals that generate these data, and they are held by private companies, and there are legitimate uses for scientific and policy purposes. How is it that we can kind of create an ecosystem? How can we create a framework for data governance at the global level? I mean, we have some examples of this, for example, through the GDPR in the EU, but how can we create a framework that allows these different interests to be realized so that there is both potential for valuable data use while at the same time mitigating data misuse, right? And I think finding and creating regulatory frameworks as well as thinking about broader ways of facilitating that at an international level beyond even incremental regional models is really, really fundamentally necessary. And I guess the last point that I want to touch on, which I think is really important, is that we really need to think about training and data capacity building and thinking about that in a global way, right? So at the moment, we are all recognizing that there's clearly lots of new, exciting types of data available, but a lot of the training and capacity building for engaging with making sense of new sources of data are still extremely siloed, either to specific individuals, often in the global north, or in specific elite institutions. And we need to find a way to move beyond that, right? We need to create, for example, data innovation centers, training pipelines more globally to ensure that really if we want to leverage new data streams and the data revolution, we have skills and capacity to be able to do this across the world and across different sectors, not just in academia, but also in civil society, also in national statistics, and so on. So I'll leave it at that, and maybe we can come back to more discussion later.
Thank you. And I think that leads very well into understanding better the collaboration or the tripartite relationship between governments, the private sector, and individuals who own the data. So maybe, Makoto, it would be good to hear from you around how NEC sees their role in that public-private partnership and management of data.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So in terms of the public-private partnerships, so my company NEC sees a lot of engagement with the UN, like UNDP, WFP, FAO is some of the project. I want to introduce around the agriculture context. One of the things is like utilize the technology, we call the blockchain technology, to the small-scale farmers to identify which farmers is what crops, what volume of the crops is harvesting. Then those are the information captured in those of the platform. Then this information to help the farmers to certain level of the product quality, then they can get the revenue because they can sell the higher prices. So those are the things technology help of the human beings in terms of the quality control. Then this is also the relation with the government. Government side also improve the quality of this product, the crop product to export more. So those are the things is one of the case studies for the public-private partnerships. For the another case study, we have also some opportunity to further engagement with the UNFPA for the, actually we call the beneficiary management platform. So this is for the help, or the UNFPA help for the vulnerable population, including the women and the small children. Those of the digitize the platform to manage of the information, to keep up the, in terms of the security and the privacy. At the same time, also digitize of the those of the support. So we call the subsidy program to digitize, we call the e-voucher, to digitize the services, those of them. This is one of the functions. Then also analytics portions is come to the pictures. Those of the platform to analyze of the transactions. So those information to help of the UN organization to well improve of the operation. Those are things as well. Then also the feedback functions. This is really important for the feedback from the beneficiaries to those of the cross communication to improve of the support. This is really important to utilize the right opinion come from the peoples. So I think this is a case of the some project side, but I think you said, Ricky said about the more for the governance side. So governance side, I think really more public-private partnerships required. Those kind of like multi-stakeholder meetings, joint, come from the public sector, also the private sector joint. Those are the field, because the technology come from the private sectors. But we have to discuss to how to secure, utilize those data, and how to protect all the privacy in terms of the privacy and the data protections. So this is, I think the project basis, yes, we are also involved them. The governance and those of the policy side, my company also involved those of the conference to speak what is important from the point of view from the private sectors.
Yeah, thank you. And I think what you touch on in terms of data governance and bringing together those different partners is really important, and understanding the respective roles of the different players who are designing technologies, but also digital public infrastructures. So maybe, Resvanul, it would be interesting, I think, to hear from you around what kind of systems you know, what the role of government is in that partnership in terms of, you know, assessing, auditing, and ensuring that you know, what technology is designed to be rolled out is in fact effective and is producing the kind of data that we can use, or is truly representative data.
So we started auditing for these specific use cases only a couple of years back. Just to give you an understanding, during COVID, the social safety net, the government's money distribution for the social safety net became very tough. So what we did, we had a map of the population that needed that social safety net subsidies, right? But we did not have a delivery method or kind of an access method. So we created a public-private partnership kind of a data exchange modality. What happened is we took mobile telco data of relevant recipients. For example, the government gives subsidies, a monthly subsidy for in cash to lactating mothers, right? So how do I ensure that the subsidy is going to the actual person, right? In most of the cases in third world countries or in developing countries, what happens is these marginalized population or marginalized women, they don't get to decide on the financial matters. Their head of the household, which is more often than not male, holds the bank account or mobile financial account, right? And so they make the financial decisions. So what we did, previously what happened, this kind of disbursement with the data, we correctly identified the person who was supposed to be getting that subsidy, but the financial delivery was happening through another way. So we tried to combine these two. So we worked with mobile financial service provider, the telco service providers, and we ensured that a mobile financial account is open for the mother herself. and the money will go to the mother herself. So these kind of equitability ensuring methods, we then try to incorporate in other government services. So the important part was we are now carefully looking at all the access modalities for government services, and we are trying to figure out, whether the access modalities are equitable or not. Because if we at least ensure the access modalities, if they are equitable, then the public service delivery becomes, in some cases, automatically equitable. So that's our focus right now.
Thank you, Rezwanul. And I think maybe bringing it all together, Andrea, it would be great to hear from you around, what data governance systems look like. Like, what does that overarching enabling system need to be, bringing together all of the different partners to try and make sure that, the roles and responsibilities of different actors are really well understood, and that, we're essentially not doing harm.
Right. Right. Well, it's a good question. How do we make sure that we're not doing harm? And to go back to something that Riddhi said earlier, we know from traditional research methods that it's almost impossible to do any kind of research that doesn't somehow harm somebody, even in a very, very mild way, right? Like, I'm going to ask you a few survey questions. My harm is maybe they're probing questions, but maybe I'm just taking up your time from doing something like that, to the very, very horrible examples we hear. But I do think it's worth thinking about from a data governance perspective. The first thing I want to say is compliment the government of Bangladesh on your efforts. I wrote this down because I love the phrase, the citizen-centric solutions, I think is a really beautiful starting point. And I want to commend your commitment to standardizing the data infrastructure, something I tell my students who are going on into careers as data scientists that, we're going to spend most of our time in class talking about machine learning and algorithms and computer vision and all that stuff, but you as a data scientist are going to spend most of your time cleaning data sets and trying to get one data set to talk to the other data set, and even if it's really close. So bravo. So I think a big part of data governance going forward at a global level is going to be this standardization. But that is a huge problem, and what different countries, never mind regions within different countries, want to collect, have the capacity to collect, can collect ethically without putting citizens in danger, depending on what sorts of potentially sensitive things we're asking about, is going to be a very, very difficult question indeed. I mean, even, I do some work with companies that are global companies, and the types of questions we're able to ask of citizens in the United States versus citizens in Turkey is very, very different. And so trying to understand how employee experiences is almost impossible. And so imagine that's in the context of a private company that can kind of do whatever it wants. So it's really going to be a difficult conversation to think about how do we standardize while also protecting the privacy or understanding that there are things we can't collect in all places, I think is one piece. I think another piece that I really want to, Riddhi, I love that you brought up, we want to use the traditional data and we want to use any new data that's coming along. And one thing I always advise whenever we do any analysis is use the same analysis on as many different data sets as possible. So I want to understand fertility rates using the traditional data. Okay, I find this particular pattern in this particular country. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the social media data that I have or the other trace data that I have. Maybe I'll find a different pattern. If I find a different pattern, that means I back up and I say, okay, one of these might be missing something, one of these might be speaking to different populations, or maybe I need different interventions depending on the general demographic that's participating here or here. And so I think, again, from a global level, that means not just saying here's one data set that we're all going to agree to use, but maybe here's a suite of data sets that we might use in combination, we might consult separately, and so on. And then the last thing, and I love that you were speaking about this, is something that I genuinely don't have. I'm gonna offer a bigger problem. I don't have a solution for this. Is this trade-off between data privacy and data transparency? So when I'm, doing something online or participating in a survey or filling out my census form in the United States, I want to know how my data is going to be used. I want to know if it's going to be counted in this particular way. Is it anonymous? Where are you taking it? And I make a living in data science, and I can't figure out how Instagram is using my data. I have no idea, right? But I also want privacy in that I don't want them sharing information with the world about what I'm doing, and particularly with this trace data that's potentially very powerful and also potentially very dangerous. And I can just give one example of tension that I think we all need to think about is in academia. I have a number of colleagues who work in the role of social media and political views and political behavior. And one of the biggest challenges to conducting research on things like, does exposure to misinformation on Facebook contribute to such and such types of political outcomes? How good are people at detecting misinformation or disinformation? How do we tell if someone is a real person or a bot or a kind of a halfway hybrid or whatever? One of the biggest limitations to being able to understand any of that is that the Metas, Googles, et cetera of the world keep all their data. And they keep it because they can make money with that data, and also, to their credit, they supposedly have some commitment to privacy so they can't share it. So that begs the question is, yes, we want data transparency. I would like those researchers to have my Facebook data, but that's because I know who they are and what they're going to do with it. And so then the question of who has access to this data becomes a really, really big one. And if I'm a citizen and I know that in my location the government's going to have access to X, Y, and Z data, I might not provide that data. But on the other hand, I also, in principle, want to know how many people there are of this particular demographic or who've gotten abortion or whatever it is that we do want data on. And so I don't have a good answer on how we navigate this line of as much transparency as possible in terms of collection and methods and what we're doing with the data and where we got it, while also respecting privacy and allowing people to be owners of their data. And I guess one last thing I'll say on this that concerns me as well, I'm just raising problems, is the increasing ability to pay for data privacy, right? Like I can pay a certain amount of money and no longer get exposed to ads on YouTube. And I see trends like that only continuing, where soon our data will be this currency, or maybe it already is, this thing that I can sell. And if I'm selling it, it's probably because I don't have the resources to pay to have it under control. And that also probably means I haven't gone through the educational system that allows me to understand how it's being used. And so I really think that this data literacy piece and helping people understand more broadly, not just, hey, we're collecting data from you, and by the way, you have access to it, and again, Bangladesh, congratulations on tracking access to data, but empowering people to do things with it, regardless of their level of education, I think is something else that this wonderful Data Governance Institute needs to think about.
Thank you. I think you raised so many points there. I don't even know where to
I think we're all just stressed out now. Yeah.
But I mean, I think the issue of consent and data privacy are really closely enmeshed, and understanding what data is being collected. I think in general, most of us don't know what data is being collected against us every day.
Right.
Let alone how that may be being used against us or for us.
Right.
Because I think it can go either way. And I think that comes back to, I think Makoto, you were talking about safety by design and making sure that at the inception of technology and the inception of conversations like, with the Bangladesh government, thinking through how do we make sure the technologies are safe by design? How do we make sure they're inclusive by design? How do we ensure that consent and privacy is embedded in those, and auditing systems, obviously, to make sure that we can genuinely use that data as representative. So, thank you. I think you raised a lot of problems, but I do think there are ways of doing it. And I know, Rita, you've spoken to political solutions. I don't know if you want to speak to. I don't know if you want to speak to that, or, as opposed to technological solutions, very often it's a much more political solution. Before I close.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think just on so I think there are some models for how we could, how we can, to sort of try and resolve this tension between data privacy, data transparency, to the extent that it is helpful for scientific and policy purposes. And I think, as I said, one model of how we might try and do that is provided by the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, which does hold platforms to account to, for example, to make more transparent to individuals how their data is being collected, which means that every time you visit a website in the European Union, it does mean that you have to answer a lot of questions about what kinds of ads you want to see and what kinds of cookies can be stored, which of course from a data use perspective does create interesting secondary issues of potential bias and selection into specific types of use of platforms. But on the other hand, it does give users some degree of knowledge about what is being done. And I think over time, so that's one particular model where, and so that is at the user, at the individual perspective, but then also there is, within the GDPR, a requirement to also make platform or any kind of, or different kinds of data that is being held by companies available for scientific purposes. So there is a clause about that explicitly, which I think is relevant. And of course, you know, this is not to say that that's the only way to do it, but the fact that it is a clause in there is really relevant for us to think about as we try and think of this as a sort of governance problem, right? We need to actually, I think we can't just say, oh, we'll all come across on the table and on a project by project basis do this with cooperation. I do think we need to get law and regulation involved in this because we need to hold people to account and we need to make individuals aware of how their data are being collected, but we also need to have often platforms and companies also be brought into this conversation and sometimes be coerced into this conversation. So it's, yeah, I think this, and this needs to be sort of sector-wide. It can't be, as I said, on a piecemeal, project by project basis. And I say the reason it needs to be interoperable, it needs to be, of course, global, because in a sense, a lot of these data that we're talking about now are truly global, but a lot of the frameworks for regulation for how to make these data usable for scientific and policy purposes, while at the same time respecting consent and privacy, are not global, right? So there are differential standards being applied. So it's very easy still for some companies to say, oh, I'll just move these data somewhere else, and then different regulation will apply to them. And I think that's something, that's an issue we need to sort of navigate and address. And I think coming back to this point about sort of, you know, we've talked a lot about sort of selection bias related issues, but I think from a pure, even if we want to think about, you know, digital technologies are not just digital public and data goods, they're also providing us new ways to live our lives, access goods and services, make sense of the world, which means that we need to really understand also from a broader SDG perspective, the idea, we need to measure and understand who is using digital technologies, how they're using them, when they benefit from them, and when they don't, right? And that requires us to really also be actively collecting information, demographically disaggregated information on the use and uptake of digital technologies, of digital public infrastructure. And I think that's something that we need to then hold governments to account about as well. You know, we need to say, you need to be collecting these, just as any kind of public delivery of service really needs to be held to account through auditing, through impact assessment. The same thing should be said of digital tools and services as well.
I can offer one small additional solution that you reminded me of as you were describing the holding people to account. Is a simple and very imperfect model in academia around data privacy and data ownership. And you know, the big trend in the 2000s and 2010s in research was to have all your data open source. You can see the models that you used, you can download the data, everything is there. And then we all thought about it for a half second and said, oh gosh, maybe I shouldn't make all of this data completely public. And so it's a euphemism or a term that sounds fancier than it is, but the walled garden model is basically one very small step towards slightly controlling who has access to data and keeping track of what people are doing with your data. So all that means is you basically, and we all have probably encountered this, you go onto some website to download data and you can't just download it, you have to fill out a teeny little form with your email address, if you have an institutional affiliation, and generally what you plan to do with that data. That's not a good, that alone is not the solution, right? Because you could immediately just go on and pretend to be someone that you're not and do whatever you want with the data. Once the data is downloaded, there's nothing preventing you from sending it around, but maybe that's a starting point where we say, okay, all of this data is now publicly available. If you want to access it, you do need to prove you're a real person, and you do need to go through credentials, and then maybe there's some way, there's still issues with that because you're still gonna leave out folks who maybe want to see the data and don't have an institutional affiliation, which I think we should, but that sort of kind of like small fence just to slow down the ability to just kind of pull everything. It would slow down bots from basically pulling anything from the internet because you would have to go through some, you know, I am a human qualification. We haven't even talked about generative AI, though, which is a whole other, so never mind.
No, but I think that's really important. But also, even when you have access to the data, is there computational power
Right.
in one individual, even one small organisation, to be able to analyse it, to clean it?
Right.
Or do we need to be looking at consortiums of researchers to be able to understand, to be able to clean the data, or even understand and unpick the bias that's in there, and,
Right.
and find ways of balancing it? And I think Rebecca, who's not with us, is doing a lot of work on collection of diverse language data sets to be able to infiltrate or to be able to balance existing large language models in AI. So I think there's lots of different solutions, but I think we're standing in between us and coffee and afternoon tea for those who are jet lagged. So with that, I would just like to really thank you for coming, for being part of the panel, Resvanel for joining online, and really, really valuable to hear from the work of the Bangladesh government, and I think how you're already tackling so many of the challenges that we've raised this afternoon. So with that, I will say thank you very much for joining us and sharing your insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Robinson, and our distinguished speakers, for your invaluable contributions to today's discussion on harnessing technology and data to promote resilience for a smart future. Now we invite all our guests to a brief tea break at the foyer outside the Rupushi Bangla Grand Ballroom. We will reconvene at 4:20 p.m. for our last two parallel sessions for today. The session on intergenerational well-being and healthy aging will take place in the same Crystal Ballroom. The session on the future of population data will take place in the Rupushi Bangla Grand Ballroom. A cordial reminder to all delegates, please secure a seat in your chosen session room by 4:20 p.m. Should your preferred room have no more seats available, we kindly ask you to join us in another session. Your punctuality is greatly appreciated as we aim to maintain the integrity of our schedule. Thank you once again to our esteemed panelists and the moderator, and we will see you all again for our next session. Thank you.